Hello everyone. I hope you enjoy listening to the story. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 36 years old. I was still wearing black at my husband's funeral when his children started putting price tags on my furniture. The flowers around Richard's casket had not even begun to wilt yet, but Damian and Claire were already turning our home into a marketplace. Small white stickers covered the dining room like a disease. One sat on the crystal vase Richard bought me for our 10th anniversary. Another hung from the grandfather clock beside the staircase. Even the leather chair where he used to drink coffee every morning had a number attached to it. I stood there in silence, my fingers shaking around a paper cup of cold coffee, while strangers walked through my house whispering bids to each other like vultures circling fresh roadkill. Claire spotted me near the staircase and smiled without warmth. She wore a white designer dress to her own father's funeral. Let that sink in. White pearls, white heels, white gloves. She looked less like a grieving daughter and more like a realtor preparing for an open house. "Try not to touch the display items," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. A few people looked away in embarrassment. Others pretended not to notice. Damian stood beside the fireplace, speaking with the auction company manager. His voice stayed calm and polished. The same voice he used in courtrooms to destroy people for a living. "The estate liquidation begins Monday morning," he announced. "Everything must go quickly. We want to preserve the Harper family legacy." The Harper family legacy. I almost laughed. I spent 20 years building that life beside Richard. I hosted his charity dinners. I stayed awake through endless business crises. I held his hand through chemotherapy while Damian sent flowers instead of showing up. Yet somehow, I was suddenly an outsider standing in the middle of my own memories. After the guests left, I wandered through the mansion alone. The silence felt rotten. Price tags still clung to everything around me. One was attached to our wedding photograph. I pulled it off so hard that the frame cracked in my hands. That was when I found Richard's old coat hanging behind the study door. His scent still lingered in the fabric. My chest tightened so violently I had to sit down. Then my fingers brushed against something heavy inside the pocket. A small brass key. At first, I thought grief was making me dramatic, but Richard never kept random things. Not ever. 3 hours later, I sat inside a private bank vault downtown, staring at a thick envelope labeled with my name in his handwriting. Inside was a stack of legal papers for something called Harper Legacy Holdings, LLC. Beneath them sat a handwritten letter. "If my children ever turn grief into greed, let them sell everything, then buy it back." I read those words 3 times. Then I looked at the auction date printed on the estate notice and smiled for the first time since my husband died. The next morning, I sat across from Martin Keller in his downtown office while rain crawled down the windows behind him like tears that refused to stop falling. Martin had been Richard's attorney for almost 15 years, and in all that time I had never seen the man look nervous. His silver pen tapped against the conference table in uneven rhythms while he studied the documents spread out between us. "Evelyn," he said carefully, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves could betray us. Richard planned this years ago. He did not trust Damian with money, and he definitely did not trust Claire with property. I stared at the paperwork inside the envelope again. Harper Legacy Holdings, LLC. Richard had transferred ownership rights quietly over the last 4 years through a maze of legal filings and holding companies. The mansion, the Tahoe Villa, the classic cars, even part of the art collection had all been shielded under the LLC. My name sat at the top as sole managing member. My hands trembled slightly. Then, why did he let them think they inherited everything? I asked. Martin leaned back slowly. "Because your husband understood his children better than anyone. He knew greed makes people careless." Over the next week, Damian and Claire turned my grief into a public spectacle. The estate liquidation ads appeared online less than 48 hours after the funeral. They advertised exclusive luxury assets from the Harper estate. Not once did they mention Richard as a husband or father. To them, he was already inventory. Every morning, Strangers entered the mansion carrying clipboards and cameras, while Claire floated through the halls, pointing at furniture, like a queen dividing conquered territory. I overheard her laughing near the wine cellar with one of her friends. "Thank God Dad finally passed before the tax situation got worse," she whispered. "Now we can unload everything before the government gets involved." The coldness in her voice made my stomach twist. Damian became worse after the funeral ended. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. One afternoon, he summoned me into Richard's old study. He sat behind my husband's desk, wearing one of Richard's watches on his wrist. That nearly broke me. "We need your signature on a waiver," he said, sliding papers toward me without even pretending kindness. "This confirms you will not contest the estate distribution." Claire stood near the bookshelf, sipping champagne at 2 in the afternoon. "Honestly, Evelyn, this is better for everyone," she added. "Dad already took care of you for 20 years. Most women would be grateful for that." Grateful. I felt heat rise into my chest so fast, I almost snapped right there. Instead, I lowered my eyes and let my voice shake deliberately. "I just want peace," I whispered. Damian relaxed instantly. He mistook silence for weakness. That was his first fatal mistake. That same night, Martin drove me to a small office building near the riverfront. The sign outside simply read Northern Capital Acquisitions. Inside waited a quiet man named Daniel Pierce, who managed the anonymous bidding division connected to the LLC. Richard had prepared everything long before his death. Daniel explained the process calmly while sliding auction catalogs across the desk. "You cannot bid directly," he said, "if Damian recognizes your involvement. He could delay probate and freeze certain transactions. The LLC will operate through private representatives." My pulse quickened as I turned the pages. Every item from my life stared back at me in glossy photographs. Richard's vintage Aston Martin, the marble dining table where we celebrated every anniversary, the painting we bought during our trip to Florence. Even my wedding ring had somehow been listed among the estate jewelry. Claire truly intended to sell every piece of my marriage for cash. The first auction took place 3 days later at a luxury hotel in Sacramento. I sat in the back corner wearing plain black clothes while wealthy collectors filled the ballroom. Damian moved through the crowd, shaking hands confidently. Claire posed near the auction displays as if she were hosting a gala instead of dismantling her father's life. When Richard's Aston Martin rolled onto the stage, my chest tightened painfully. I remembered him teaching our grandson to polish the chrome on Sunday mornings. I remembered the way he laughed whenever the engine roared too loudly in the garage. The auctioneer opened bidding at $200,000. Within seconds, Daniel raised the price through a remote bidder account tied to the LLC. Another investor countered. Daniel responded again immediately. The numbers climbed higher and higher until the room finally fell silent at $480,000. Sold. Damian smiled proudly, believing some wealthy stranger had overpaid. He had no idea the buyer was me. That became the rhythm of the following weeks. The anonymous bidder kept winning everything that mattered. Richard's watch collection, the vineyard shares, the artwork, even the dining room chandelier Claire once mocked as old-fashioned. Every victory felt strange, not joyful exactly, more like reclaiming pieces of myself before strangers could scatter them forever. Meanwhile, Damian and Claire grew increasingly irritated. They needed fast cash because their financial situation was far worse than they admitted publicly. Martin eventually showed me confidential reports Richard had gathered before his death. Damian owed almost $900,000 in private gambling debt tied to casino markers in Las Vegas. Claire had borrowed heavily against future property commissions that never materialized after the housing market collapsed. They were drowning long before Richard died. His estate simply looked like a lifeboat. One rainy evening, Martin arrived at the mansion carrying another folder. His expression had darkened considerably. "There is something else," he said quietly. We sat together in the kitchen where Richard and I once shared midnight coffee during storms. Martin opened the folder slowly. "The mansion carries an unpaid federal tax lien worth approximately $1.8 million. Several commercial properties also contain hidden liabilities attached directly to Damian and Claire through inheritance law. I stared at him in silence while thunder rattled the windows. Does the LLC absorb any of that debt? I finally asked. Martin shook his head. No, the LLC only acquires the assets themselves through clean title purchases. The heirs retain the liabilities personally. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I looked toward the dark hallway leading to Richard's study and finally understood the full scale of my husband's plan. Damian and Claire believed they were inheriting an empire. In reality, they were inheriting a collapse already set in motion long before the funeral flowers arrived. The final estate auction took place inside the mansion itself exactly 12 days after Richard's funeral. By then, the house no longer felt like my home. It felt like a theater built for my humiliation. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway from early morning, while valets guided wealthy investors, collectors and socialites through the front gates. Sacramento's elite arrived dressed for entertainment, not mourning. Women in expensive coats carried champagne glasses through the same hallway where Richard's hospital bed had stood only weeks earlier. Men laughed near the staircase beneath the giant family portrait Damian planned to sell before sunset. Every room smelled of perfume, polished wood, and greed. Claire treated the entire event like her personal victory party. She floated through the ballroom wearing a cream-colored silk dress, so tight she could barely sit down. Diamonds glittered around her neck while she greeted bidders with rehearsed sympathy. Dad would have wanted the estate preserved by people who truly appreciate quality. She kept saying with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. I watched her from across the room while pretending to study one of the art displays. She had already spent half the projected profits before the auction even began. I overheard her bragging to a realtor friend about a penthouse in Miami she intended to purchase once probate cleared. Damian stayed near the auctioneer reviewing financial reports every few minutes. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt despite the cold weather outside. He needed this sale desperately. That much had become obvious. I arrived alone wearing the same black dress from Richard's funeral. No jewelry. No makeup beyond enough powder to hide the exhaustion beneath my eyes. Several guests glanced at me awkwardly before looking away. In their minds, I was already erased from the Harper legacy. Claire noticed me standing near the dining room entrance and walked over slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor like tiny warning shots. Evelyn, she said sweetly, you really should sit somewhere comfortable. These events can become emotionally overwhelming for older people. Her fake concern made my skin crawl. Then her eyes drifted toward the antique silver display beside me. And please do not touch the items. Some of them are extremely valuable. She said it loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. A few people exchanged uncomfortable looks. One older woman actually frowned at Claire's cruelty, but nobody said a word. Nobody ever says a word when rich people become monsters in public. The auction began at noon sharp. The ballroom lights dimmed while the auctioneer stepped onto a small stage beneath a massive portrait of Richard. Seeing my husband's face towering above the crowd while strangers bid on pieces of our life nearly shattered my composure. The first items sold quickly: wine collections, sculptures, rare watches. Every time the anonymous bidder entered the competition through Daniel Pierce's remote account, prices climbed aggressively. Damian initially looked thrilled. Higher bids meant more money. More money meant temporary survival. But after the sixth consecutive item sold far above market value to the same unidentified buyer, his expression started changing. His jaw tightened each time the auctioneer shouted sold. Claire noticed it too. I watched panic slowly replace arrogance in her eyes. Then came the moment that nearly exposed everything. Richard's piano rolled onto the stage. My chest tightened instantly. That piano mattered more to me than almost anything else in the house. Richard used to play old jazz songs late at night whenever insomnia kept us awake. During his chemotherapy treatments, he became too weak to stand some mornings, but he still managed to sit at that piano and play with trembling hands because he knew the music calmed me. Claire laughed softly beside one of her friends while the bidding opened. Honestly, I almost donated that thing, she whispered. It takes up too much space. I felt something cold move through me then. Not sadness anymore. Fury, pure and silent. The opening bid started at $20,000. Within seconds, Daniel countered remotely at 30. Another collector jumped to 40. Daniel immediately answered with 60. The room shifted. People began murmuring. The auctioneer's voice grew louder with excitement while the numbers climbed higher and higher. 80,000, 100,000, 120,000. Finally, the opposing bidder surrendered with visible frustration. Sold for $150,000, the auctioneer announced proudly. Damian nearly smiled again after hearing the final number. Then his phone vibrated. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. He stepped away from the crowd, reading something rapidly while pressing the phone tighter against his ear. Claire followed him toward the hallway, irritation flashing across her face. They disappeared into Richard's old study together. A few minutes later, Martin quietly approached me near the staircase. The IRS officially flagged the estate transfer, he murmured. Federal tax liens are now visible in the system. Damian just found out. My pulse remained calm, surprisingly. Almost too calm. And the LLC? I asked softly. Martin adjusted his glasses. Protected completely. The debt remains attached to the heirs personally. For the first time since Richard died, I finally understood what true revenge looked like. It was not screaming. It was not smashing dishes or exposing affairs or begging for justice. Revenge was patience. Revenge was letting greedy people sprint toward their own destruction while believing they were winning. The auction continued, but the mood inside the mansion had changed completely. Damian returned, looking pale beneath the ballroom lights. Sweat glistened along his forehead now. He kept checking his phone between sales while whispering furiously to attorneys near the back wall. Claire stopped smiling altogether after overhearing fragments of the IRS conversation. Yet neither of them could stop the process anymore. Every contract had already been finalized. Every sale had already transferred clean ownership into Harper Legacy Holdings LLC, piece by piece. They had sold me my own life while unknowingly trapping themselves beneath millions in hidden liabilities. Then the final item of the evening appeared on stage. The mansion itself. The ballroom fell silent as the auctioneer announced the opening bid for the Harper estate property. Damian stood frozen near the fireplace, while Claire gripped a champagne glass, so tightly I thought it might shatter in her hand. Daniel raised the anonymous bid immediately. Another investor countered. Daniel responded again without hesitation. The price climbed higher and higher while whispers spread across the room. Damian suddenly looked toward me across the ballroom. Really looked at me for the first time in weeks, and in that exact moment I saw it happen. He finally understood someone had been playing a game far bigger than him. The probate hearing took place 4 days after the final auction inside a crowded courtroom in downtown Sacramento. By then, the story had already spread through most of the city's business circles. People whispered about the mysterious bidder who bought nearly every Harper asset during the liquidation. Rumors bounced between country clubs, law offices, and charity luncheons. Some people believed Damian secretly arranged fake bids to inflate the estate value. Others thought a tech investor from Silicon Valley planned to turn the mansion into a private resort. Nobody suspected me. That was the beautiful part. They spent weeks staring straight through me, like I was invisible. And invisible people are the most dangerous of all. I arrived early that morning wearing a dark navy suit Richard bought me years ago for one of his corporate galas. The fabric fit loosely now after months of stress and sleepless nights. But for the first time since the funeral, I no longer felt small. Martin met me outside the courtroom, carrying 3 thick binders under his arm. Damian is inside arguing with federal attorneys already, he whispered quietly. Apparently the tax situation escalated overnight. I nodded without surprise. Richard's timing had always been surgical. Even dead, the man still knew exactly when to pull the trigger. The courtroom slowly filled with lawyers, creditors, investors, and a few curious reporters who sensed scandal in the air. Damian sat at the front table beside Two exhausted attorneys whose expensive suits could not hide the panic underneath. Claire looked completely different from the woman who mocked me during the auction. The confidence was gone. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook every few seconds while checking messages on her phone. I overheard her whispering furiously to someone about frozen accounts and canceled transfers. Apparently her Miami penthouse dream had died before the paperwork even started. Then the federal attorneys entered. Everything changed after that. 3 people in dark suits walked directly toward Damian's table, carrying stacks of financial records. One of them handed documents to the judge, while another quietly spoke with Martin near the aisle. Damian stood abruptly. "This is highly irregular," he snapped loudly. "The estate assets have already been liquidated." The federal attorney barely looked at him. "Mr. Harper, unpaid tax obligations do not disappear simply because you sold furniture quickly." A few people in the courtroom laughed under their breath. Damian's face turned crimson instantly. The hearing officially began 10 minutes later. At first, it sounded like any ordinary probate proceeding. Asset transfers, ownership verification, estate distribution. Then the numbers started appearing on the courtroom screens. Unpaid federal tax, liens totaling $1.8 million. Commercial property debts exceeding $3 million. Casino-related liabilities tied directly to Damian Harper. Potential fraud investigations connected to Claire's real estate transactions. The silence inside that courtroom became almost physical. You could actually feel it pressing against people's chests. Claire stopped breathing for a second when the fraud allegations appeared beside her name. Damian kept interrupting the judge until one of his own attorneys finally grabbed his arm and forced him back into his chair. Sweat rolled down the side of his face while he flipped through papers, desperately searching for something that no longer existed. An escape, a loophole, a miracle. Then came the final blow. Martin stood slowly and approached the judge's bench carrying the LLC documents. Richard left behind. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "Harper Legacy Holdings LLC legally acquired the Harper estate assets during public auction through clean title transactions finalized before federal seizure proceedings began." Damian froze completely. His eyes moved from Martin to me, so slowly it almost looked painful. "No," he whispered. "No, that is impossible." Martin continued, speaking with the same steady tone. "The debts remain attached to the heirs through inheritance liability statutes. However, the purchased assets now belong solely to Harper Legacy Holdings, LLC. The judge adjusted his glasses while reviewing the paperwork carefully. "And who is the managing owner of this LLC?" he asked. Martin turned toward me. "Evelyn Harper." Every sound inside the courtroom disappeared. Claire's mouth literally fell open. Damian stared at me like he had never seen me before in his life. One of the reporters near the back nearly dropped her pen. Even the federal attorneys looked mildly impressed. I rose slowly from my seat, my hands perfectly calm now, and walked toward the front of the courtroom while dozens of eyes followed me across the floor. Damian stood suddenly. "She manipulated him," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She planned this entire thing." Martin looked at him with cold disappointment. "No, Damian," he replied quietly. "Your father planned this after spending years cleaning up your disasters." Claire started crying then. Real crying, not the fake elegant tears she used during charity events. Mascara streaked down her cheeks while she grabbed Damian's sleeve like a frightened child. "Do something," she whispered desperately. "You are the lawyer. Fix this." But there was nothing left to fix. Richard had already closed every door long before his funeral even happened. The judge finalized the transfer less than 20 minutes later. The mansion, the Tahoe Villa, the cars, the artwork, every meaningful piece of Richard's life now belonged to the LLC. To me. Meanwhile, Damian and Claire remained buried beneath millions in debt they never bothered to investigate because greed blinded them completely. As the courtroom emptied, Damian approached me one last time. His arrogance had vanished entirely. The expensive watch was gone from his wrist. His tie hung loose around his neck like a noose, tightening slowly. "You knew," he said quietly. "You sat there during the auction and watched us destroy ourselves." I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "No," I said calmly. "Your father watched that happen years ago." Claire collapsed into a chair behind him, while creditors immediately surrounded her attorneys near the hallway. Federal agents continued discussing financial freezes only a few feet away. Reporters rushed toward the exits, trying to break the story first. Everything around Damian and Claire was falling apart at once, fast and loud and ugly. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired, deeply tired. Then Damian asked the question that finally broke whatever sympathy remained inside me. "So what now?" he whispered bitterly. I looked him directly in the eyes and gave him the only answer he truly deserved. "Thank you for selling me my own house at a discount." Even his lawyer stopped speaking after that. 6 months later, the mansion no longer felt haunted. Sunlight returned to the hallways that once echoed with whispers and greed. I opened the gardens to charity events supporting widows who had suffered financial abuse after losing their spouses. Every Thursday evening, women gathered in Richard's old ballroom, drinking tea beneath the same chandelier Claire once tried to auction away for quick cash. Sometimes I would stand quietly near the staircase and listen to them laugh. Real laughter, the kind that only comes after surviving humiliation. It reminded me that pain does not disappear overnight, but dignity can return when people stop apologizing for protecting themselves. I restored Richard's study exactly the way he left it. His books remained stacked beside the leather chair near the window. His reading glasses still rested on the side table. Some nights, I sat there alone with a blanket over my knees, staring out at the gardens while rain tapped softly against the glass. I used to wonder whether revenge would make me feel guilty. Strangely, it did not. What haunted me was not what happened in court. What haunted me was the memory of Damian placing price stickers on family photographs before his father was even buried. The fallout destroyed both of them faster than anyone expected. Damian lost his law license 3 months after federal investigators uncovered hidden gambling, debts tied to client accounts. His creditors chased him through every remaining property he tried to protect. Last I heard, he was renting a tiny apartment outside Reno and working temporary consulting jobs under someone else's supervision. Claire's downfall became local gossip for weeks. Her fiancé disappeared the moment her accounts were frozen. She eventually started selling designer handbags online just to cover legal fees. Karma moves slowly sometimes, but when it finally arrives, it rarely knocks politely. A few people accused me of being cruel. One woman at a fundraiser actually asked how I could sleep peacefully after taking everything from Richard's children. I remember smiling at her because the question itself revealed something important. People always blame the person who closes the trap. They rarely blame the people who walked into it willingly. I did not force Damian and Claire to humiliate me. I did not force them to auction their fathers. Memories like clearance items inside a department store. And I certainly did not force them to ignore every warning sign while chasing money they believed already belonged to them. The truth is simple. Richard gave his children a choice long before he died. They could have mourned him. They could have protected the family with patience and dignity. Instead, they chose greed. Greed made them rush. Greed made them arrogant. And greed made them blind enough to sell me my own life while smiling straight into the camera. Sometimes I still think about the moment Damian looked at me in that courtroom after realizing everything was gone. The anger, the panic, the disbelief. But what stays with me most is the silence afterward, because deep down, even he understood the truth. They were never destroyed by me. They destroyed themselves the second they started auctioning there. Father before the ground over his grave had even settled. So tell me honestly, if you were standing in my place, would you have warned them about the debt first? Or would you have stayed silent and let greed finish the job for you? Sometimes people think revenge is loud. They imagine screaming matches, broken dishes, or dramatic speeches. But the most powerful revenge is quiet. It is patience. It is letting arrogant people expose themselves while you stay calm long enough to survive them. Damian and Claire believed grief made me weak. In reality, grief made me fearless. And in the end, the only thing more expensive than their greed was the price they paid for underestimating me. If this story made you angry, shocked, or satisfied, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more real-life family drama stories filled with betrayal, revenge, and emotional justice. And I truly want to hear your opinion. If you were in my position, would you have warned them about the hidden debt before the auction? Or would you have stayed silent and let karma do the work? Leave your answer in the comments below. Your story or opinion might be featured in the next video.